Before the name of Chernobyl became synonymous with nightmare, it was the embodiment of a dream forged in the ashes and paranoia of a fractured world. To understand the wound, we must first unveil the ambition that preceded it. After the Second World War, the planet split in two, like a frozen rock under the blow of a hammer. On one side, the West and its promise of individual freedom. On the other, the Soviet Union, a colossus stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific, wrapped in the red mantle of its ideology and the certainty of a manifest destiny. The Iron Curtain was not just a political border, it was a tectonic fault in the human psyche, and over this divided landscape floated the memory of two terrible suns that had blossomed over Japan, heralding a new era, the Atomic Age. In the Kremlin, the men who governed 1/6 of the Earth felt the chill of strategic exposure. They had achieved parity in terror with their own bomb in 1949. But nuclear peace was a precarious balance, a pulse sustained over a red button. The real war, the one that would define the future, would be fought in the fields of science, industry, and progress. It was imperative to demonstrate to the world and to themselves that the Soviet system could not only compete, but could build a brighter, fairer, and above all, more powerful tomorrow. And at the heart of this promise, at the core of its technological gospel, burned the atom. The same force that could annihilate cities in an instant, their scientists and leaders reasoned, contained the key to an energy utopia. The concept of the peaceful atom became a state doctrine, almost a faith. It was the sword turned into a plowshare, the fury of fission tamed to serve the people. The narrative was powerful. While capitalism wielded the atom as a threat, socialism would raise it as a banner of enlightenment. The proof of this faith arrived in the summer of 1954. In the discreet city of Obninsk near Moscow, something extraordinary occurred. In the silence of a laboratory, a steam turbine began to spin, powered not by coal or water, but by the heat released from a core of uranium. For the first time in history, an electrical grid received energy from a nuclear power plant. A light bulb flickered and lit up with a steady white glow. It was a modest light, barely 5 megawatts, enough for a handful of homes, but its symbolic glow was blinding. It was the first light of a new Soviet dawn. That silent success unleashed a tide of ambition. Nuclear energy ceased to be a theory and became the cornerstone of the future. Smoke-free cities were promised, factories that would never sleep, icebreakers that would navigate the Arctic for years. It was the messianic solution to electrify an empire of 11 time zones, to bring modernity to the remote steppes and the depths of Siberia. A network of gigantic power plants was planned, each a testament to Soviet ingenuity, each a step closer to victory in the Cold War. It was believed, with the faith of new converts, that the atom could be a docile servant. There was trust in science, in calculation, in the unyielding will of the state. It was a confidence born of necessity and hubris, a pact with a force they were just beginning to understand. In that race for supremacy, in that rush to tame the fire of the gods, the seeds of what would come next were sown. And so, in the vast plains of Ukraine, on the misty banks of the Pripyat River, the planner's gaze fell upon the black and fertile land. There, where the pine forests whispered ancient stories, a new titan would rise, a monument to that faith, a city and its atomic heart. And so, the dream of the peaceful atom, born in the offices of the Kremlin, sought a place on Earth to take root. Not in the windswept steppes, nor in the frozen depths of Siberia, but in the heart of Soviet Ukraine, in a land of swamps and birch forests that seemed to exist outside of time. The Polisia region, bathed by the slow and dark waters of the Pripyat River, a place where the morning mist clung to the trees like an ancestral memory, and the only sound was the singing of birds or the crunch of frost beneath the boots of a hunter. Here, in this sanctuary of stillness, the 20th century decided to plant its most ambitious and terrible cathedral. The choice of location was not a poetic act, but one of cold logic. The nuclear giant would need an inexhaustible torrent of water to cool its feverish heart, and the Pripyat River, with its proximity to the great Dnieper that fed Kyiv, was an ideal candidate. The power it would generate would be injected directly into the network of the Ukrainian capital, a bright symbol of Soviet progress. On the planners' maps, the ancient landscape became a grid of possibilities. The millennia-old forests were mere obstacles to clear. The meanders of the river were resources to channel. Silence was the first sacrifice. The men who made these decisions, from the ministers in Moscow to the chief engineers on the ground, were mostly individuals imbued with an almost religious faith in science and in the manifest destiny of the Soviet state. They were immersed in a tide of national ambition, driven by the urgency of 5-year plans that demanded results, not deliberations. In their minds, they were not desecrating an ancient land, but awakening it from a long slumber. They were bringing light, literally, to a forgotten corner of the empire. Any doubts, if there were any, were a whisper drowned out by the roar of ideology. Construction began on the threshold of the decade of 1970. Thousands of workers, young and hopeful, arrived from all corners of the Union. They brought with them little more than the clothes they wore and the promise of a better future, a decent salary, a modern apartment, and the opportunity to be part of something monumental. The air was filled with the smell of turned earth, freshly cut pine, and the smoke of bonfires in the improvised camps. Fatigue clung to their bones like mud to their boots, but there was a fervor, a collective energy that transformed the landscape day by day. The steel and concrete skeleton began to rise above the mud, defying the icy breath of winter and the relentless sun of summer. At the heart of the project was the reactor, the RBMK 1000, a uniquely Soviet design, a colossus of graphite and pressure tubes. Unlike Western reactors, whose containment vessels were forged in specialized factories and transported as a single piece, the RBMK could be assembled on site. It was a decision born of both convenience and scale. It allowed for the construction of reactors of immense power without relying on an industrial infrastructure that the Soviet Union did not yet fully possess. But this flexibility came at a hidden price, a series of technical compromises that made it inherently more volatile. Furthermore, its design allowed for the extraction of weapon-grade plutonium, a silent echo of the Cold War that throbbed beneath the pretext of civilian energy. Haste was the invisible and cruel foreman. Deadlines had to be met. Medals and honors awaited those who delivered the project on time or ahead of schedule. It has been documented in later memoirs that lower quality materials were used, that welds were not always perfect, that small cracks in the concrete were ignored or simply covered up. Warnings were lost like echoes in the vastness of the turbine halls. Every brick laid, every cable strung was an act of faith in the infallibility of the system. The Chernobyl plant was not built on stone, but on the arrogance of believing that human will could completely subdue the forces it was unleashing. And as the first reactor came to life in 1977, casting its geometric shadow over the river, something else was growing beside it. For alongside the graphite colossus, another promise was taking shape, a utopia of concrete panels and green parks sprouting from the forest. A city was born from nothing, designed to house the guardians of the atom and their families, a place that would bear the name of the river that gave it life, Pripyat. Thus, in the shadow of the reactors that rose like concrete titans, a city flourished. Its name was a whisper in the forests of Polesia, Pripyat. It did not emerge from the slow accumulation of centuries, like other cities of stone and memory. Pripyat was an act of will, a dream of the atomic age sculpted in cement panels and wide avenues that cut through the landscape like lines drawn on a perfect map. It was conceived as a paradise for a new elite, that of the nuclear man. Its inhabitants were young, the average age barely exceeding 26 years. They were the physicists, the engineers, the technicians who each morning made the short journey to the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin plant, the pulsating heart that gave meaning to their existence. In exchange for their loyalty to science and the state, the Soviet Union granted them a life of privilege unimaginable in other parts of the empire. New and warm apartments, stores with well-stocked shelves, modern schools, and a magnificent palace of culture named Energetic, the epicenter of their social life. The light of an April morning settled over its streets. A pale northern light filtered between the identical buildings and made the dew shine on the parks. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, an ancestral aroma that mingled with the almost imperceptible hum of modernity. The murmur of buses carrying men to the first shift could be heard, the echo of children's laughter in the playgrounds, the sound of a ball against a wall. It was the pulse of an orderly, predictable, safe life. In the afternoons, families walked along the river that bore the city's name. Children fished in its waters, unaware that its current lapped at the shores of the power plant. Women returned from shopping with bags full of provisions that were a luxury in Moscow or Kiev. There was a sense of optimism, an unshakable faith in progress. They believed they inhabited the future. They were the pioneers of a cleaner, more powerful world, governed by the domesticated force of the atom. In the center of the city, a yellow Ferris wheel stood still. It was planned to be inaugurated for the celebrations of May Day. It was a symbol of the promised joy, a promise of festivity that floated in the still air. No one could know that its cabins would never host the laughter of children, that its silhouette would become the spectre of a time halted. Life in Pripyat was a symphony of tranquil routines, a precise choreography where each citizen knew their role. The fatigue of the worker after a 12-hour shift, the concentration of the teacher explaining the water cycle, the chatter of friends in a cafe while the evening fell outside. They lived oblivious to the nature of the beast they fed. For them, Reactor number 4, visible on the horizon like an industrial cathedral, was not a threat. It was the metallic sun that warmed them in winter, the source of their well-being, the guarantor of their future. It was the silent God they served without asking questions. And so, the city slept under its protection. It slept in the confidence of its calculations and in the solidity of its concrete. It could not feel the invisible tide that began to rise, nor hear the anomalous heartbeat that, within that colossal structure, began to run wild. For the heart of Pripyat was not in its central square or in its homes. Its true heart, a heart of graphite and uranium, beat 3 kilometers away, preparing in the silence of the night to break. While the children of Pripyat slept under the promise of a bright future and the city of atoms breathed to the tranquil rhythm of the night, at its center pulsed a heart that was not made of flesh, but of graphite and uranium. A colossus of concrete and steel held within its depths the power of 1,000 suns, and also the seed of a tragedy yet unwritten. To understand the ash that would soon cover the fields of Polesia, we must descend into the labyrinth of its design, to the very architecture of Reactor number 4. It was known by a name that was, in itself, a declaration of Soviet power and pride. RBMK 1000. Reactor Bolshoi Moshchnosti Kanalny. The high-power channel-type reactor. It was not a simple machine. It was the standard bearer of an engineering philosophy, a titan conceived in the haste and ambition of the Cold War. Its design possessed a brutal beauty, an economic logic that made it attractive to a state that needed energy on a large scale and quickly. Unlike Western designs, it did not require a massive and expensive pressure vessel forged in one piece. The RBMK could be assembled on site like a gigantic Meccano set, reducing costs and accelerating construction. Its core could be refueled while operating without the need to stop its productive pulse, an advantage that promised an unceasing tide of electricity. And in the deepest secret of its conception, in the DNA of its design, pulsed a dual purpose. It could generate energy for cities and, with subtle modifications, produce plutonium for the nuclear arsenal. It was a heart with 2 beats, one for life, another for death. But every fortress casts a shadow, and the shadows of the RBMK were long and deep, woven with the threads of compromise and arrogance. The first crack in the stone, the first whisper of fate, resided in its positive void coefficient, a technical phrase, almost harmless, that concealed a deadly paradox. In most reactors, the water that cools the core also moderates the nuclear reaction. If that water overheats and turns to steam, a void, the reaction slows down, the reactor calms. It is an inherent safety mechanism, a natural law of self-protection. In the RBMK, it was not so. Here, the main moderator was not water, but a massive block of pure graphite, a black and silent matrix of almost 2,000 tons where the fuel rods were housed. The water, flowing through the channels, primarily served as a coolant and absorbed neutrons. If that water turned to steam, fewer neutrons were absorbed, and the nuclear reaction, instead of shutting down, accelerated. It was a design that, on the edge of the abyss, instead of retreating, took a step forward. A beast that, sensing its leash loosen, became wilder. To this fundamental flaw was added another, an irony so cruel that it seems extracted from a Greek tragedy. The control rods, the emergency brake of the reactor, designed to be inserted into the core and stop the fission, had a birth defect. Their ends were made of graphite. When initiating an emergency shutdown from a low-power configuration, in the first and fateful moment, before the absorbing material of the rod came into action, the graphite tips displaced the water and caused a momentary and violent spike in energy. It was the cure that, for a second, aggravated the disease. The saving embrace that began with a blow. Finally, the Titan had no cage. For economic reasons, the RBMK reactor lacked the robust containment structure of concrete and steel that was standard in the West. The building that housed it was an industrial construction, not a fortress designed to withstand the apocalypse that slept within. The men who designed it were not evil. They were brilliant engineers, children of an era of certainties, pressured by a system that rewarded production and speed over caution. They built a powerful but unstable giant, a complex machine full of dark nuances, and then handed its operators incomplete manuals, like maps of a territory from which the abysses had been omitted. They trusted that the beast would never be pushed to the limit of its temperament. But time, with its infinite patience, always finds a way to test the foundations of everything that man builds. And in the calm that precedes the storm, in the silence of a spring night, in the control room of Reactor number 4, a group of men prepared for a test. A safety test, they called it. A final attempt to understand the beast, unaware that their actions would not tame it, but awaken it from its slumber. The memory of the reactor's design, with its virtues and its shadows, now dissolves like the fog over the swamps of Polesia. We leave behind the blueprints and the manuals, the cold certainty of engineering, to enter the realm of human action, where fatigue, pride and chance weave their own inescapable tapestry. We delve into the night of the 25th of April, 1986. It was a Friday. The afternoon light gilded the concrete panels of the plant and filtered through the windows of the apartments in Pripyat, where families were preparing for the weekend. The air carried the scent of damp earth and pine, the promise of the awakening Ukrainian spring. In the courtyards, children played their last games before dinner, their voices an ephemeral echo of life against the immense silence of the forests. Nothing in the outside world betrayed that time was bending upon itself, about to break. Inside the control room of Reactor number 4, history had begun to quicken its pulse. A test was scheduled, a safety test, the most ironic of paradoxes. Its goal was noble in its conception, to verify if, in the event of a total blackout, the steam turbines, in their slow dance of deceleration, could generate enough energy to power the cooling pumps during the critical minute it took for the emergency diesel generators to start. It was a bridge of 60 seconds over the abyss. The test had been attempted before, unsuccessfully, and the stubbornness to complete it had become a matter of professional honor. But fate, or perhaps just the anonymous bureaucracy of a distant power grid, had other plans. A call from the Kiev grid control demanded that the power reduction be postponed. Another plant had failed, and Chernobyl's energy was needed. The test, which was to be conducted in daylight with an experienced team, was pushed into the shadows of midnight. The day shift, familiar with the nuances of the procedure, gathered their things and went home, leaving the task to a night team, smaller in number and with fatigue etched in their eyes. In charge that night was Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer. A complex man with an iron will forged in the nuclear submarine shipyards of the Far East. His faith in human control over the machine was absolute, almost religious, and his impatience with doubt or hesitation was legendary. Alongside him were the shift supervisor, Alexander Akimov, and the young reactor operator, Leonid Toptunov, competent men caught between the procedural manuals and the inflexible authority of their superior. When the test finally resumed, already in the early hours of the 26th of April, a chain of errors began to forge itself, link by link. During the power reduction, an operational error caused the level to plummet far below the expected. The reactor, like a great frightened animal, began to poison itself with xenon-135, a byproduct of fission that absorbed neutrons and smothered the chain reaction. It was a chemical shroud descending upon the core. Dyatlov, dismissing the hesitations of Toptunov and Akimov, ordered that the power be raised at all costs. To achieve this, decisions were made that broke with all prudence. One by one, the control rods, the graphite and boron brakes of the reactor were manually withdrawn, far beyond any written safety limit. It was like stripping a sleeping giant of its chains, hoping it would obey one last command. The reactor became unstable, an unpredictable beast. The men in the control room, illuminated by the green glow of the screens, read numbers that made no sense, data that contradicted their training. But the test had to continue. The will of one man weighed more than the laws of physics. Outside, Pripyat slept under a star-speckled sky. In cribs and beds, its inhabitants dreamed ordinary dreams, oblivious to the atomic heart that a few kilometers away began to beat with a feverish and erratic pulse. The clock struck 1:23 in the morning. The button to start the test was pressed, and the silence of the night waited, holding its breath, the echo of a tide of fire that was about to be born. The time in the control room of reactor number 4 had become dense, almost palpable. The constant hum of the machinery, which for years had been the familiar heartbeat of a domesticated giant, now sounded tense, feverish. On the faces of the men, the weariness of a night that refused to die mingled with a dull anxiety, the doubt that entangles obedience. Alexander Akimov, the shift supervisor, felt the weight of the room on his shoulders. A universe of dials and blinking lights that no longer responded with the predictable logic of stone and steel. Next to him, the young Leonid Toptunov, with barely a few months of experience, struggled to tame a beast of untamed power whose responses had become erratic, almost furious. It was 1 hour and 23 minutes past midnight on the 26th of April, 1986. The moment hung suspended, like a drop of water about to fall. Faced with the unstoppable drop in power and the growing instability, Akimov made the decision that any manual would have dictated. The only logical decision left. He pressed the AZ5 button, the emergency shutdown switch, an act designed to be salvation, to insert all the boron control rods into the core and smother the chain reaction. It was the definitive gesture of man over machine. But the design of this reactor held a dark secret, a flaw as deep as the arrogance of its creators. The graphite tips of the rods, upon entering first, displaced the coolant water and, for a fatal moment, instead of extinguishing the reaction, accelerated it exponentially. It was not a sound. It was a fracture in the fabric of reality. First, a dull tremor, a vibration that originated in the bowels of the earth and rose through the concrete columns, shaking the control panels. The men clung to their consoles as the entire building groaned like a mortally wounded animal. Seconds later, the first explosion, a burst of steam that ruptured the fuel channels and lifted the upper biological slab, a 2,000-ton lid, as if it were the lid of a pot. The cold nocturnal air from outside rushed into the exposed heart of the reactor, mixing with the hydrogen and overheated graphite. And then, the second explosion. A roar that tore through the night, a blinding flash that illuminated the Polisia plain with the light of a dark sun. The detonation of an incomprehensible violence pulverized the roof of the building and sent a column of incandescent graphite, nuclear fuel, and radioactive debris soaring into the sky. A column of bluish light, of impossible and deadly beauty, ascended into the night sky, the ghostly glow of air ionized by radiation, so intense that it was visible. It was the heart of a dying star on Earth. Inside what remained of the control room, the universe had dissolved into chaos. The alarms howled in a chorus of mechanical panic. Dust and acrid smoke filled the air, with a strange metallic taste in the mouth. "The core has exploded!" shouted a young operator, his voice broken by terror and dust. "You are mistaken," replied an authority still anchored in the world of yesterday. "A reactor cannot explode." The human mind, even in the face of the evidence of its senses, clings to the truths it knows, to the certainty that stone is solid and fire can be extinguished. Akimov, pale as ash, sent his men into the darkness of the crumbling building to attempt to manually lower the control rods that no longer existed, to open valves to pump water into a reactor that had disintegrated. These were the first steps of a pilgrimage toward death, taken in complete ignorance. But something else had been unleashed in those two explosions, something that did not burn with the orange flame of the graphite that now consumed the roof. A colorless, odorless poison, a breath of dead suns that began to permeate every atom of air, metal, and skin. And as the fire painted the horizon orange and the city of Pripyat slept under a veil of indifferent stars, a silent tide began its journey. The first firefighters, alerted by the fire on a roof, were already running toward the plant, unconscious heroes rushing to extinguish a fire whose true nature could not yet be named. The echo of the broken stone and the torn metal still trembled in the air. In the control room of Reactor number 4, the universe had contracted to a moment of dust, tremors, and an alarm that was already an endless lament. The heart of the machine had stopped beating to explode, but in the minds of the men who guarded it, the truth struggled to be born, suffocated by the learned certainty that an RBMK reactor could not explode. Alexander Akimov, the shift supervisor, a young man upon whose shoulders rested the weight of an unleashed atom, looked at the panels with eyes that refused to process the catastrophe. Beside him, Leonid Toptonov, barely a boy, pale as marble, felt the ground opening beneath his feet, not from the tremor, but from the abyss of his own action. His first reaction was not panic, but disbelief, a disbelief as deep and rooted as the concrete foundations of the building itself. It had to be an emergency water tank, a hydrogen explosion, anything but the core. Outside, the night had been torn apart. Above the smoking remains of the reactor building, a pillar of unreal light rose, of a blue and an orange as beautiful as they were deadly, an aurora borealis born from hell. The air suddenly had taste, a taste of metal and ozone, the icy kiss of uncontrolled fission. But inside, in the bubble of denial, the orders followed the logic of a world that no longer existed. "Open the valves! Water must be pumped into the reactor to cool it." Akimov's voice, tense but firm, clung to the manual, to the procedures that were his only anchor in a tide of chaos. He did not know he was ordering water to be poured over 1,700 tons of incandescent graphite, feeding the fire, scattering radioactive ash into the silent skies of Ukraine. The men ran through dark, debris-filled corridors, their boots splashing in water that was already a colorless poison. They were sent to manually lower the control rods, a futile mission in a reactor that was now nothing more than a funeral pyre. The low-reading dosimeters they carried simply went off the scale, their needles pinned to the maximum, useless. The only high radiation meter was locked away in a safe, inaccessible in the confusion, as if the very bureaucracy refused to measure the magnitude of its own end. Calls began to flow outward, like messages in a bottle cast from a shipwreck. Viktor Brukhanov, the plant director, was awakened in his apartment in Pripyat. His first conversation with Akimov was a dialogue of the deaf, an exchange between reality and desire. "There has been an accident," said the voice from the plant. "How serious is it?" "I do not know for sure. There is a fire." The word explosion was avoided, whispered, denied. The information that ascended through the chain of command, toward Kiev and then to Moscow, was a distorted echo of the truth. A fire on the roof, the reactor intact, the situation under control. It was the response of a system built on the stone of infallibility, incapable of admitting a crack in its own facade. Meanwhile, the first responders, the firefighters from the plant station and nearby Pripyat, arrived. They saw the flames licking the sky and, unknowingly, ventured into the heart of the fallen star. They climbed onto the rooftops, their feet sinking into pieces of black, slippery graphite that they mistook for mere tar. Each of those fragments was a piece of the exposed core, emitting a dose of radiation that would seal their fate in a matter of hours. Their heroism was pure, born of ignorance, as they fought against a fire that was not of this world, feeling a strange metallic taste in their mouths and a burning on their skin that they confused with the heat of the flames. At dawn, a strange stillness descended upon the plant. The visible fire had been extinguished, but the ghostly glow persisted. The men who had fought all night, the operators and the firefighters, began to fall. Nausea, uncontrollable vomiting, an unnatural tan blooming on their faces and hands. It was the silent signature of the invisible tide that had already consumed them. And a few kilometers away, the morning sun rose over Pripyat, bathing the empty playgrounds and balconies with laundry in its golden light, a city that, unknowingly, no longer had a future. The echo of twisted iron and the fire licking the sky had faded, leaving behind an unnatural silence, a hum that was not heard with the ears, but felt in the marrow of the bones. For 36 hours, invisible death had rained down on Pripyat, an impalpable ash that settled on the swings of the parks, on the windowsills, on the hair of the children playing under an oddly pale spring sun. It was Sunday, the 27th of April, a day that should have been one of rest and routine, but was already stained by a poison that had no name or form. In the improvised crisis rooms, time had become dense, sticky. The men of the governmental commission, their faces marked by lack of sleep and the weight of a catastrophe they were just beginning to comprehend, made an inevitable decision. The model city, the Soviet atomic dream, had to be emptied. The order was a grave whisper, a sentence pronounced softly that sealed the fate of nearly 50,000 souls. There was no public debate, no staggered warnings. The system that had built Pripyat as a monument to its power would now dismantle it with the same relentless and silent efficiency. During the night and morning, a ghostly fleet had converged on the region. More than 1,200 buses, requisitioned from Kiev and its surroundings, formed a long yellow serpent on the outskirts of the city, waiting for the signal. Their engines, still off, seemed to hold a collective breath. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the radios of Pripyat came to life. Not with music or news, but with a faceless, metallic, and dispassionate voice, reading a statement that would be etched in fire in the memory of a generation. Attention, dear comrades. The Council of People's Deputies informs that, due to an accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the radiation conditions in the city of Pripyat have deteriorated. To ensure the total safety of the residents, and primarily of the children, a temporary evacuation is necessary. It is recommended to take with you your documents, essential items, and a supply of food for 3 days. The evacuation will begin today, the 27th of April, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. 3 days. That was the pious lie, the anchor to which everyone clung. In the concrete apartments, a hurried and confused choreography began. Documents, photo albums, a change of clothes were packed away. Food was left for pets, convinced of a quick return. How to pack a life in 1 hour. What object to choose to represent all that is left behind. A forgotten doll in a crib, an open book on a table, clothes hanging on the balcony, waving like a flag of surrender. Each decision, a small wound. At 2 o'clock sharp, the portals of the buildings opened and the people emerged in a staggering order. There was no panic, no screams, just a somber obedience, the habit of a people accustomed to following instructions. They boarded the buses in silent lines, the children confused, the adults with a dull anxiety in their eyes. The engines of the long yellow serpent began to purr in unison, a low and deep rumble that was the only requiem for the dying city. As the buses pulled away, the streets of Pripyat emptied with the speed of a retreating tide. The windows of the apartments became blind eyes, looking at a world without people. The wind played with a newspaper in the empty square. The prevailing sound was no longer that of voices or cars, but the constant and ominous crackling of the dosimeters in the hands of the few soldiers who remained behind. They were not travelers departing for a short vacation. They were exiles from their own time, expelled from a poisoned paradise, though they did not yet know it. They carried with them a promise of return that time, cruelly, would take care to refute. And as they moved away, the government, in its distant tower in Moscow, had still not pronounced its version of the truth to the world. The official silence was, in itself, an even vaster radiation. The buses had departed, leaving behind a silence that weighed more than any sound. The city of Pripyat, emptied of its soul in a matter of hours, had become a monument to haste and fear, its open windows like surprised eyes facing a sky that was no longer the same. The echo of sirens and engines had faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind in the birches and the distant, almost inaudible crackle of the dying heart of Reactor number 4. That local silence, dense and laden with invisible particles, was the prelude to another silence, much more vast and deliberate, the silence of an entire state. 800 kilometers away, in the corridors of the Kremlin, where the cold marble and thick carpets muffled any step, the echo of the catastrophe arrived muted, like the murmur of a distant tide that barely wets the shore. The first reports, fragmented and tinged with the panic of those who wrote them and the fear of those who transmitted them, ascended through the chain of command like wisps of smoke. They spoke of a fire, of an accident, of a situation under control. They were words designed to soothe, not to inform, to protect hierarchies, not lives. Mikhail Gorbachev, the man of the new era, the architect of openness and restructuring, found himself imprisoned by a system of secrets. Heir to a state whose main mortar was controlled information, he now faced an enemy that could not be censored, the unleashed matter itself. In those first hours and days, his desk was not filled with the raw truth of dosimeters, but with the edited versions of bureaucrats who had learned over generations that bad news was a form of betrayal. The first reaction was not compassion, but instinct. The old instinct of the besieged fortress, which lowers the drawbridge and hides its wounds to avoid showing weakness to the outside world. And so, while firefighters died in Hospital Number 6 in Moscow, with their skin peeling from their bodies like the bark of a burned tree, the machinery of denial was set in motion. On the 28th of April, 2 days after the reactor core melted with the sky, the TASS news agency issued a brief note, a whisper amid a hurricane. It stated, "An accident has occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. One of the reactors has been damaged. Measures are being taken to eliminate the consequences of the accident. Assistance is being provided to those affected. A government commission has been created. 29 words to contain an apocalypse. 29 grains of sand to build a dam against the ocean." The dissonance reached its peak on the 1st of May, while red flags waved under a spring sun in Red Square and families paraded with rehearsed smiles, celebrating the might of the Soviet worker. An invisible cloud, laden with cesium, strontium, and iodine, had already begun its journey across Europe. In Kiev, just 130 kilometers south of the open wound, children took to the streets for their own celebrations, breathing air that sowed in their thyroids a harvest of slow death. No one warned them. The image of the state was more precious than the health of its citizens. Denial was not just a policy. It was an atmosphere, a veil woven with pride and fear that spread over the poisoned land. In the fields of Belarus and northern Ukraine, life continued its timeless rhythm. People planted potatoes in the black earth, milked their cows, let their children play under a fine rain that seemed to cleanse the world. No one told them that the air was poison, that the rain was radioactive ash, that the warm milk they drank was a chalice of isotopes. They trusted. And that trust was the first and deepest victim of the official silence, a wound in the collective soul that would fester for decades, long after the radiation began to decay. But the silence of an empire, as stony as it may seem, cannot wall off the wind, and the wind, which knows no borders or loyalties, blew westward, carrying in its breath not only broken atoms, but the seed of a truth that would soon bloom in the panic of an unsuspecting world. In a nuclear power plant in Sweden, an alarm was about to sound, a discordant note that would shatter the silence orchestrated by Moscow and force the truth at last into the light. As the Kremlin wove a heavy cloak of silence over the fields of Polisia, while spectral smoke rose toward an indifferent sky, a messenger was already riding bridleless to the west. It was neither a man nor an intercepted radio echo. It was the wind, a spring wind that carried in its breath not the aroma of damp earth and pines, but an invisible dust, a lethal whisper of broken atoms. The truth, like water, always seeks a crack through which to seep, and this was a truth that travelled on the tide of the air. It was the morning of Monday, 28th of April, more than 1,000 kilometers away on the coast of Sweden. At the Forsmark nuclear power plant, the light of the Baltic was clean and cold. The day promised to be like any other. A technician, while passing by a routine radiation monitor, triggered a shrill alarm. The initial panic was internal, a chilling stab of fear. Was there a leak at Forsmark? Protocols were activated, systems were checked, but the plant was sealed, intact, its uranium core beating with the predictable calm of controlled physics. However, the radioactive particles were there, clinging to the soles of their shoes, like strange pollen brought from an unknown and terrible garden. Soon, other sensors in Sweden and then in Finland and Norway began to sing the same anomalous song. The scientists, men accustomed to reading the secret language of the elements, leaned over their instruments. The analysis did not lie. The detected isotopes, iodine-131, cesium-137, xenon-133, were not just any mixture. They were the unmistakable signature, the fingerprint of a Soviet RBMK reactor after a core meltdown. The wind, with its impartiality of an ancient god, had brought the evidence to their doors. It had betrayed the secret. Diplomatic calls began to cross the Iron Curtain, first as polite inquiries, then with a growing urgency that barely veiled the accusation. In Moscow, the men of the Politburo, who had believed they could contain the catastrophe behind a wall of denial, felt the ground cracking beneath their feet. They could silence their citizens, control their newspapers and televisions, but they could not order the wind to return, nor the Geiger counters of the West to remain silent. The lie, so carefully constructed, crumbled like ash. For 2 days, the official silence persisted, an act of defiance as futile as trying to stop the tide with bare hands. But international pressure was already a clamour. Finally, on the night of 28th of April, the state news agency, TASS, issued a terse statement, a masterpiece of bureaucratic obfuscation that barely occupied a few lines in the world's teletype. It reported that an accident had occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, that one of the reactors had been damaged, that measures were being taken, nothing more, not the explosion, nor the fire, nor the radioactive cloud that was already covering half of Europe. It was the confession of a wounded giant, murmured through clenched teeth, full of shame and resentment. The ghost was no longer confined to the forests of Ukraine. It now had a name: Chernobyl. The word began to resonate on the radios of Paris, in the headlines of London, in the fearful conversations of families in Germany. The invisible enemy of the Cold War had materialized, not as a missile, but as an ethereal and democratic presence in its reach, one that did not distinguish borders, ideologies, or social classes. An atomic truth cannot be contained by fences or by decrees of men. Its lineage is that of the stars, and its voice, the silence that follows the light. The world was now watching, but from the safe distance of maps and reports. There, in the wounded land, the black sun of the reactor continued to burn, vomiting its poison into the sky. And while diplomats exchanged notes and scientists measured the radioactive fallout, other men and women, made of flesh and bone, not of lead and concrete, were preparing to walk directly into the heart of that hell. The echo of official silence had been shattered against the distant monitoring stations of Sweden, and the truth, like a flood contained for too long, began to seep through the cracks of the Soviet monolith. Denial had died. In its place, a cold and desperate urgency was born. The spring of 1986 had taken on a colour that no one could name, and over the fields of Polesia floated an enemy that marched under no banner. It had no face, no voice, nor the sound of iron. It was a ghost woven into the very air, a poison in the pollen of flowers and in the milk of cows. And to combat a ghost, an army of living men was summoned. They began to arrive in a silent and orderly tide. They were not the armies of old epics, with shining armor and banners in the wind. They were miners from Tula and the Donbass, with skin hardened by coal and eyes accustomed to darkness. They were pilots who had seen the skies of Afghanistan, now called to fly over a different hell. They were engineers, drivers, doctors, cooks, and above all, young reservists pulled from their quiet lives, from their factories and farms, by an order that allowed no questions. They were given a bureaucratic and clinical name that history would remember with a shiver: the Liquidators. Their task was simple in its conception and impossible in its scale: to liquidate the consequences of an atomic catastrophe. Their battlefield was a landscape of deadly stillness. The ghost town of Pripyat, with its swings swaying in a contaminated wind, was the silent camp from where they departed towards Reactor number 4. The wounded heart of the beast continued to burn, casting an invisible column of death into the sky. The first were the pilots. In a mechanical and suicidal dance, their helicopters flew through that radioactive plume, so intense that the instruments went haywire, and they dropped bags of sand, clay, lead, and boron in an attempt to smother the fire and filter the poison. Each pass was a dose, a tribute paid to the enraged atom. Some returned with a metallic taste in their mouths, the first kiss of radiation sickness. Then came the work on the roof. The graphite expelled by the explosion covered the roof of the adjacent reactor, emitting levels of radiation so fierce that the machines and robots sent to clean it saw their circuits fried in seconds. When technology faltered, when the pride of Soviet engineering melted away, flesh and bone were called upon. They were called bio-robots, a cold name for the warmest and most desperate act. They were men dressed in rudimentary lead protections that barely covered their vital organs. They went out in shifts of 90 seconds, sometimes less. Run, plunge the shovel into a piece of black and shiny graphite, throw it into the abyss of the reactor, and run back. 90 seconds to receive a dose that would mark the rest of their lives. The sound of their boots on the asphalt, the contained gasps, the dry thud of the shovel, those were the only hymns of their heroism. Underground, another battle was fought in the darkness and suffocating heat. The miners, accustomed to the dangers of fire damp, dug a tunnel beneath the foundations of the reactor to install a cooling system that would prevent the molten core, a mass of corium similar to lava, from sinking into the groundwater, threatening to contaminate the drinking water of half of Europe. They worked almost naked from the infernal heat in an effort that pushed their bodies beyond all known limits. More than 500,000 souls passed through that purgatory. Their war did not end with the last shovel of graphite, nor with the last flight over the reactor. For them, the battle became internalized, turning into the silent tally of the becquerels absorbed into the lineage of cells that would one day rebel. They received medals and certificates, promises of care that often got lost in the labyrinth of a crumbling state. They were the anonymous heroes of a secret war, and their victory was to allow others to live. They had cleared the ground, they had paid the price in blood and time, so that others could raise a shell of stone and concrete over the ashes, a monument to their sacrifice, and a tomb for the monster they had helped to chain. And so, after the sacrifice of the first men, those who walked upon the roof of hell with shovels and naked courage, a different silence arrived. It was not peace, but the tense pause that precedes the construction of a tomb. The dragon had been wounded, its fire smothered beneath tons of sand, lead and boron hurled from the sky, but its radioactive heart continued to beat in the depths of the ruin, an invisible pulse that poisoned the air, the water, and the earth. Reactor number 4 was no longer a source of energy, but an open wound in the body of the world, one that could not be healed, only contained. The task that lay before the Soviet engineers was of an almost mythological scale, to build a tomb for a fallen and furious god. They had to erect a shell over the smoking remains, a monument of concrete and steel that would trap the atomic breath for, it was hoped, a century. They officially named it Object Ukrytaye, the shelter. But history, with its instinct for dark poetry, would remember it by another name: the sarcophagus. The summer of 1986 faded into an autumn of grey skies and feverish activity. The site was a symphony of the impossible. Gigantic cranes, brought from every corner of the Union, rose like skeletons of titans against the pale horizon. But the enemy was invisible, and the battlefield lethally silent. Radiation levels were so extreme that a man could not remain there for more than a few minutes. The technology, the pride of the Soviet era, was the first to capitulate. Western-manufactured robots, designed for delicate tasks, had their circuits fried by the torrent of gamma particles. The Soviet rovers, more robust, held out a little longer before succumbing as well, remaining like statues of inert metal in a garden of radioactive ash. And once again, when the machines failed, the burden fell upon the shoulders of men. 90,000 souls participated in that epic construction, a new generation of liquidators. They were engineers, welders, miners, and laborers. Their work was measured in seconds. A team would rush toward the structure, perform a precise task, a weld, the placement of a beam, and retreat while the next took their place, in a desperate relay against an enemy that could neither be seen nor heard. They worked at a distance whenever possible, assembling enormous sections of the structure kilometers away, to then transport and fit them together, like pieces of a colossal and macabre puzzle. More than 400,000 cubic meters of concrete were poured. 7,300 tons of steel were employed. Each cubic meter, each beam, represented a dose of absorbed radiation, a fraction of life given. The men who built the sarcophagus knew they were raising a monument that might cost them their own futures. They felt the metallic taste in their mouths, the perpetual fatigue in their bones, but they pressed on, driven by a sense of duty that transcended fear. They were the stonemasons of a cathedral dedicated to forgetfulness, a fortress designed not to protect the living, but to enclose the dead. For 206 days and nights, the sound of metal against metal, the hum of cranes, and the roar of trucks filled the dead air of the exclusion zone. Finally, in November of 1986, the last concrete slab was placed. The sarcophagus was complete. From a distance, it appeared a clumsy structure, a scar of stone and steel imposed upon the landscape. It lacked the elegance of a pyramid or the grace of a mausoleum. It was a work of necessity, not of art. A beast of concrete crouched over the destroyed reactor, full of cracks and built in haste. And although the pulse of the reactor was now muffled, the silence surrounding the sarcophagus was heavier than ever. It was the silence of a sealed tomb, one that contained a poison that would remain active for millennia. The concrete could imprison the physical remains of the reactor, but it could not contain the echo of its poison. That echo had already begun its long journey, invisible and insidious, through the blood and breath of hundreds of thousands of people, initiating a silent countdown in the cells of the heroes who contained it, and of the innocent victims who simply breathed the air on a spring day. The external wound was covered, but the internal one was just beginning to reveal itself. Concrete had hardened over the broken heart of reactor number 4. The great sarcophagus stood as a mausoleum of the atomic age, a tombstone for unbridled ambition. It contained the fire, yes, but the poison had already spilled. Like invisible ink on an immense parchment, radiation had written its sentence not on the walls of abandoned buildings, but in the marrow of bones, in the delicate code of life itself. The true impact would not be measured in tons of concrete, but in the silence of hospitals and in the echo that would resonate through generations. For the first men who arrived at the mouth of hell, the firefighters, the plant operators, radiation was not an abstract concept. It was a physical tide that struck them with the force of a hammer. They tasted metal on their tongues, a strange burning on their skin as if they had spent the day under a sun that did not exist. Soon, the skin on their faces and hands took on a spectral bronze hue. It was the so-called nuclear burn. Their bodies, within hours, became battlefields. The cells, the very bricks of their being, began to dissolve. 28 of those brave men extinguished in the following weeks, in isolated hospital rooms in Moscow, their bodies betraying them from within in a process of living decomposition that science barely understood. They experienced the terrible lucidity of acute radiation syndrome, that deceptive calm, almost an improvement, before the final storm ravaged their systems. They became the first human ashes of Chernobyl. But this was only the first wave, the most violent and visible. The true extent of the tragedy would unfold with the slow and cruel patience of time. Hundreds of thousands of people, the liquidators, the evacuees, the inhabitants of nearby villages who had not been warned in time, had breathed the air and drunk the contaminated water. They now carried, unknowingly, a seed of misfortune, especially the children. Playing in the playgrounds of Pripyat and the villages of Belarus, while an odorless cloud passed overhead, they inhaled iodine-131, a thief masquerading as a vital nutrient to be absorbed by their small thyroid glands. For years, silence. Life seemed to continue. But by the early 90s, doctors began to notice something anomalous. A dizzying, almost vertical increase in cases of childhood thyroid cancer. An illness that had once been a medical rarity became a silent epidemic. They were children paying a debt incurred on a spring day they barely remembered. Their bodies were the living testament of the catastrophe, a lineage marked by a mistake they did not commit. For the 600,000 liquidators, the future became a grim lottery. Every cough, every fatigue, every unexplained pain was a question. Is this it? Has it begun? They lived under a cloud of statistical uncertainty. Cataracts increased, as if radiation sought to veil the eyes that had seen too much. Cardiovascular diseases became more common, as if hearts had grown weary from bearing so much weight. The connection to other types of cancer remains a murky debate, a battlefield of studies and counter-studies. But beyond the numbers, there was the psychological weight. Being a Chernobylite was to carry an invisible stigma, a mark that generated fear in others and profound loneliness within oneself. It was the fear of what the body remembered, even as the mind tried to forget. The impact on health was not just a list of ailments. It was the erosion of trust in the future. It was the anguish of a mother looking at her child and wondering what invisible legacy she had bequeathed. It was the chronic fatigue of a man who once was strong and now felt the weight of lead in his veins. The sarcophagus had sealed a physical ruin, but it had unleashed a plague on the human soul, one that could not be contained by steel or concrete. Individual pain, multiplied by thousands, became a pattern, a statistic that cried out to be understood. And as doctors struggled to treat symptoms they had never seen at such scale, the global scientific community began to turn its instruments, not toward the starry sky, but toward the stained map of Belarus and Ukraine, trying to decipher the terrible language that radiation had written on human flesh. After the roar and the sacrifice, a different kind of silence arrived. It was not the silence of the fields of Polesia, pregnant with latent life, but the heavy and oppressive silence of ignorance. As radioactive ash settled over the moss and soil of half of Europe, as doctors fought against an invisible enemy in the sterile hallways of hospitals, the world of science held its breath. The impossible had happened, and no one, outside the most hermetic circle of the Kremlin, knew for certain why. The truth was a ghost, and scientists, like ancient priests, were the only ones who could attempt to shape it, tracing its contours from the echoes that came from the other side of the Iron Curtain. The first wave of information, filtered through Soviet censorship, was confusing and contradictory. An accident, yes. A fire. A human error. But for the international community of nuclear physicists, these explanations were like dry leaves covering an abyss. The cornerstone was missing, the mechanism of the failure. Reactors do not explode that way, not without a fundamental reason, a crack in the very foundations of their design. Scientific curiosity, that force as ancient as humanity, now mingled with a deep fear. Every nuclear power plant in the world, from California to Japan, had suddenly become a question mark. In August of 1986, 4 months after the core of reactor number 4 melted into the night, the Soviet Union summoned the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. The scientific world attended, not with the camaraderie of a congress, but with the solemnity of a tribunal. The air in the conference room was thick, laden with the weight of the unspoken, with the cold courtesy of the Cold War. And at the center of it all stood a man, Valery Legasov, an eminent chemist, first deputy director of the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy. His eyes, framed by the fatigue of months without respite, betrayed a burden that went beyond science. He carried on his shoulders the weight of a nation and the sin of a system. For 5 hours, Legasov spoke, his voice calm and methodical, was the only sound in a room that had forgotten how to breathe. It was not a political speech, it was a confession. With a frankness that chilled the blood of his Western colleagues, he unraveled the anatomy of the disaster. He described the chain of arrogance and negligence that had led to the fatal test. He laid out, with diagrams and data, the congenital defects of the RBMK reactor. Its positive void coefficient, a design aberration that caused the reactor to dangerously accelerate upon losing coolant, and the terrible failure of the control rods with graphite tips, which, at the crucial moment of the emergency shutdown, caused a power spike instead of suppressing it. Each piece of data was a stone extracted from a grave. The scientists in the audience listened, not as ideological rivals, but as peers united by the universal language of physics. They recognized in Legasov's words the tragedy of science bent by politics, of warnings ignored, of complacency turned into catastrophe. For a moment, the Iron Curtain became permeable, not by the force of arms, but by the gravity of physics. Legasov, in revealing the technical truth, was also, perhaps unwittingly, revealing the structural cracks of the Soviet Union itself. The reaction was a mix of astonishment and a grim respect. Astonishment at the scale of the design failures and the culture of secrecy that had protected them. Respect for the intellectual courage of Legasov and his team in presenting such a damning report for their own country. Chernobyl ceased to be a mere accident and became a case study, a dark milestone in the history of technology. From that moment on, science mobilized. International programs were created to improve the safety of the remaining RBMK reactors. Epidemiological studies were initiated on an unprecedented scale, and the exclusion zone transformed into a unique and terrible laboratory where biologists and radioecologists began to decipher, with the patience of time, how life clings, adapts, and mutates in a poisoned world. Science had spoken, breaking the imposed silence, and its words, precise and cold as the steel of a scalpel, not only diagnosed the illness of a reactor, they began to dissect the body of an empire that believed itself immortal. The truth, once unleashed, is a force of nature, and its echo would begin to resonate in the corridors of power, heralding a political winter of which few suspected the severity. The scientific community had spoken with the cold and precise voice of Geiger counters and atmospheric dispersion models. Their numbers traced in the air a map of misfortune, a geography of poison that did not respect borders or ideologies. But while physicists debated about becquerels and half-lives in the stone corridors of the Kremlin, a different battle was being fought, a silent struggle against a truth that burned more than the exposed core of the reactor. There, the enemy was not radiation, but light. The Soviet state, that monolith built on certainty and control, suddenly found itself naked before the world. Its foundations, which were meant to be of ideological steel, trembled. For days, the first response was instinct, the old reflex of a lineage of czars and general secretaries. Silence. A silence dense as the autumn fog over the fields of Polisia. A silence that intended to be strength, but which the entire world perceived as fear. The official statements were brief, evasive, words like pebbles thrown into an ocean of questions. They spoke of an incident, of measures taken, but omitted the scale, the apocalyptic nature of what had occurred under the sky of Ukraine. At the center of this silent storm was a man, Mikhail Gorbachev. He was not a tyrant of the old guard, but a reformer caught between two eras. In his face, in the photographs of those days, one could sense the weight of an empire that was cracking. It is said that in the meetings of the Politburo, the tension was a red-hot metal. The veterans, men whose world had been forged in the discipline of secrecy, advocated for containing the information, for weaving a thicker veil. For them, admitting a failure of such magnitude was not an act of honesty, but a betrayal, a self-inflicted wound in the midst of the Cold War. But Gorbachev, with his gaze fixed on a future he was trying to design, understood something terrible. The poison spreading across Europe was also a poison that corroded the soul of his nation. The lie had become unsustainable. On the 14th of May, 18 days after the explosion, he appeared on Soviet television. It was not the speech of a victorious leader, but the confession of a patriarch before his family and the world. His voice was measured, but within it resonated the echo of a technological and moral defeat. For the first time, a Soviet leader admitted to his people and to his adversaries a catastrophe of such magnitude, caused not by an external enemy, but by the very arrogance and fallibility of the system. It was a crack in the armor. Through it, not only did the truth about Chernobyl escape, but the air of a new era began to enter. The consequences were a slow and unstoppable tide. Outside, the image of the Soviet Union as a competent technological superpower was reduced to ashes. Trust, that invisible capital of diplomacy, evaporated. Inside, the effect was even deeper. The tragedy gave voice and legitimacy to the ecological and nationalist movements that were beginning to germinate in the republics. In Ukraine and Belarus, the most wounded land, Chernobyl became a terrible symbol of Moscow's indifference. The disaster did not create the desire for independence, but fed it with just bitterness, with the pain of contaminated fields and sick children. The policy of openness, the transparency that Gorbachev promoted, found in Chernobyl its litmus test. In attempting to control the narrative, the Kremlin only demonstrated why openness was so desperately needed. The Berlin Wall would still take 3 years to fall, but perhaps one of its first stones was dislodged that night in April, not by the blow of a hammer, but by the invisible breath of an explosion that proved that certain truths, like radiation, cannot be contained by concrete walls or iron curtains. The political structure was forced to confront not only the unleashed atom, but something much older and more corrosive. The heavy legacy of its own culture of silence. Radioactive dust had settled over the forests of Polesia, an invisible shroud over the moss and bark of the pines. The political consequences, like a slow and heavy tide, began to erode the shores of power in Moscow. But to understand the depth of the wound, to grasp why the poison spread so freely before the first alarm sounded, we must look beyond the shattered reactor and the corridors of the Kremlin. We must delve into an architecture older and more solid than any concrete construction, the culture of secrecy. It was not a fog that descended only in moments of crisis. It was the very air breathed in the Soviet Union, a permanent state of the collective soul, a winter of the spirit that had lasted generations, forged in the paranoia of the revolution, hardened in the purges of Stalin, and perfected during the Cold War. Secrecy was not a tool, it was a pillar of the state, the cornerstone upon which the illusion of an infallible society and seamless progress was built. In this universe, information was not a right, but a privilege dispensed from above, carefully filtered. Every report that ascended through the chain of command was polished until it lost its edges. Every bad news softened until it became a harmless echo. A factory director did not report a failure, but a temporary challenge. A scientist did not warn of a danger, but suggested future improvements. The fear was not so much of explicit punishment, but of the invisible stain of being a messenger of problems, a discordant note in the grand symphony of proletarian success. And so, the RBMK reactor, with its design flaws known to a small circle of physicists and bureaucrats, became a secret kept within another. Warnings existed, written in reports that gathered dust in locked drawers, whispered in hallways by men who looked over their shoulders. Secrecy was one more component of the reactor, as intrinsic to its operation as the graphite control rods. The arrogance of a system that believed itself above the laws of physics fed on this silence. When on the night of the 26th of April, the core ruptured, the system's first reaction was not to protect its people, but to protect its lie. The plant operators, men trained in obedience, could not believe what their eyes saw, for it contradicted the official truth. The local leaders, terrified, sent reports to Moscow that spoke of a fire, of a minor accident. The truth was too monstrous, too large to fit into the standardized forms of the party. This culture of silence had consequences etched into the body and soul. While the released atom painted the air with a metallic taste, and a strange light danced over the ruins of the reactor, the children of Pripyat were allowed to play in the streets. While firefighters, without proper protection, climbed onto the roof of hell, they were told they were fighting a common fire. The truth was denied to them, just as potassium iodide was denied to them, just as the opportunity to flee was denied. Secrecy became an active accomplice of radiation, guiding it toward unsuspecting bodies. It was a lie that ultimately could not be contained. The wind does not respect ideological borders. The radioactive cloud, that incorruptible emissary, traveled westward, and its silent testimony on the screens of Swedish monitors was the cry that the Soviet Union had tried to drown out. The secret had become too large to hide under the carpet of the vast Soviet territory. It had become visible to the world. The explosion of reactor number 4 was not just a blast of steam and graphite. It was the detonation of decades of silenced truths. The sound of that explosion was the echo of countless accumulated silences. And in the cracks that opened in the structure of the state, not only did radiation escape, through them began to filter an uncomfortable, painful, and necessary light. A light that would force a leader to confront not only a ruined reactor but the crumbling system that had created it. The time for whispers was coming to an end, and the roar of truth was beginning to resonate. The echo of secrecy, as mentioned, was not just a state policy. It was the very air that was breathed in the Soviet Union, a dense fog that muffled sound and blurred the contours of truth. But in the spring of 1985, a year before the disaster, a new wind began to blow from the Kremlin. One man, Mikhail Gorbachev, had come to power with strange words on his lips. Perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. They were whispered promises of a thaw, of mending the cracks that ran through the Soviet monolith. Gorbachev was not a revolutionary seeking to topple the temple. He was a believer, a child of the system who, with the clarity of an heir seeing the family home eroded by time, wished to shore up the walls before they came crashing down. His perestroika was an attempt to revive a stagnant economic body, and his glasnost, a controlled opening, a window that cracked open to let in some light and fresh air, but without the gale of dissent blowing everything away. He envisioned a gradual reform, an orderly transition under the firm baton of the party. It was a plan forged in theory, in the silent corridors of power. Then, on the 26th of April 1986, Reactor number 4 of Chernobyl became a black sun over the forests of Polesia, and the invisible and lethal breath that escaped from its depths not only poisoned the land, but seeped into every fissure of Gorbachev's project, transforming it forever. Chernobyl did not create perestroika, but it gave it a tragic soul and a desperate urgency. In the early days, the old machinery of secrecy operated by instinct, silence, denial, the minimized reports that ascended through the chain of command like harmless smoke spirals. Gorbachev, himself a product of that system of stone and silence, found himself trapped. His instinct, like that of all Soviet leaders before him, was to contain information, to control the narrative. But the radioactive cloud did not respect borders or ideologies. The wind carried it westward, and the silent scream of Geiger counters in Sweden broke the circle of lies. It was in that moment of international humiliation that Gorbachev had to confront the deepest truth, not about a defective reactor, but about the system that had built and operated it. The culture of secrecy was not a fortress, it was a cell. The lack of transparency did not protect the state, it made it blind and clumsy. The catastrophe was not just a technical failure, it was a moral and systemic failure, a perfect metaphor for Soviet decay. The technology that was supposed to symbolize the triumph of the Soviet man over nature had rebelled, exposing incompetence, bureaucracy, and lies as the true structure of power. On the 14th of May, 18 days after the explosion, Gorbachev appeared on national television. His face, a mask of solemnity, barely contained the magnitude of the crisis. For the first time, a Soviet leader admitted to his people and to the world a failure of apocalyptic proportions. That confession, forced by the weight of facts, was the true beginning of glasnost. It was no longer a policy, it was a flood. The dam had broken. From that day on, glasnost ceased to be the cracked open window that Gorbachev had planned and became a torrent. If the state had lied about Chernobyl, what else had it lied about? The question floated in the air of Moscow's kitchens, in the factories of the Urals, in the collective fields of Ukraine. The disaster gave voice and a just cause to environmentalists, nationalists, and intellectuals. Criticism, once a clandestine murmur, transformed into a public clamor. Chernobyl became the irrefutable proof that the system was not only inefficient, but deadly. Perestroika could no longer be just an economic reform. It had to be an existential purge. Thus, the fire of Reactor number 4 fused the calculated intentions of a reformer with the harsh reality of a decaying empire. The unleashed atom not only split the uranium nucleus, it split the core of Soviet dogma. The blinding light over Pripyat illuminated the path to the end of an era. The poison had not only entered the political body, it had settled in the soil, in the water, in the moss that would grow over the ruins, a legacy burned into the very earth, as the echoes of Perestroika shook the foundations of an empire and statesmen debated the future and blame, a silence of another kind, older and deeper, settled over the lands of Polessia. The clamour of politics faded at the borders of the exclusion zone, and there, in the wounded heart of Ukraine and Belarus, a chapter began to be written that no man had foreseen. A testament not to the fall of nations, but to the tenacity of life itself. The environmental legacy of Chernobyl was not a story of absolute death, but one of strange and terrible transformation. The enemy was invisible, a ghost woven into the very air, in the water, in the earth. Cesium-137 and strontium-90, isotopes with a patience of decades, sank into the soil like a bitter seed. They filtered into the roots of birches and willows, ascended through their sap, settled in their leaves. They became the new mineral component of the soil, an atomic inheritance that would pass from the grass to the deer, and from the deer to the wolf. The first act of this silent play was performed in the so-called Red Forest. The pines, stoic sentinels surrounding the plant, absorbed the most brutal dose in the early hours, and they did not burn. Instead, in an almost supernatural manifestation, their needles were stained with a spectral colour, a rusty and funereal red, before dying standing, like an army petrified by a divine and terrible gaze. For years, that forest was a chromatic monument to catastrophe, a landscape from another world planted in ours. But where man retreated, nature, in its blind indifference, advanced. The absence of our species was a balm more powerful than the poison we had unleashed. Without tractors scraping the land, without poachers, without the incessant noise of cars, the wild world returned. Not with a roar, but with the stealth of a tide reclaiming the shore. The wolf, ancient sovereign of these forests, howled again under a moon that no longer competed with the lights of a city. Packs of wild boars turned over the contaminated earth, and the lynx, a shadow among shadows, stalked once more in the thicket. The Przewalski horse was reintroduced, a species that had already flirted with extinction, and found in this forbidden land an unexpected sanctuary. White-tailed eagles nested in abandoned power poles, and black storks, shy and elusive birds, returned to fish in the meanders of the Pripyat River. Of course, radiation was an invisible sword suspended over this anomalous paradise. Scientists who ventured into the zone found evidence of its influence. Swallows showed higher rates of albinism and tumors. Forest rodents had shorter lives and compromised immune systems. Radiation was a constant pressure, a cruel evolutionary filter that rewarded resilience and punished weakness. But the truth, as is often the case, was more complex and less spectacular than the legends of monsters. The animal population did not decrease. On the contrary, it exploded. The pressure of radiation was a lesser evil compared to the constant pressure of human civilization. And so, Chernobyl became a living paradox. The most contaminated place in Europe transformed into one of the largest natural reserves on the continent. A poisoned Garden of Eden. Every tree that broke through the asphalt of the streets of Pripyat, every nest built on the sill of an empty window, was a testament to the power of life to persist. But it was also a melancholic echo of our own fragility, a reminder that the world can continue and even flourish without us. The ghost town, with its concrete buildings devoured by moss and ivy, slowly became an artificial forest, a modern ruin that told a story not of centuries, but of seconds, And in that overwhelming silence, where only the wind and the song of a bird that never knew man could be heard, a strange curiosity began to take shape. The desire to see, to walk through the streets of a civilization frozen in time, a Pompeii of the atomic age. After the long winter of oblivion, when nature had begun its slow and silent reconquest over the Soviet concrete, a new sound started to pierce the silence of the zone. It was not the howl of the wind between the empty apartment blocks, nor the creaking of a tree growing through the floor of a gymnasium. It was the sound of human footsteps, cautious steps, accompanied by the persistent and almost rhythmic click of the dosimeters. Pripyat, the city frozen in the amber of catastrophe, was beginning a strange rebirth, not one of life, but of fossilized memory. As the new century progressed, a tide of curiosity began to rise at the borders of the exclusion zone. They were pilgrims from a strange era, armed with cameras and a longing to touch the edge of history. The Ukrainian government, recognizing the inevitable attraction of the place, began to regulate what had once been clandestine incursions. Tourist visits to Chernobyl were born, a solemn and organized procession to the heart of the wound. Buses now travel along roads that once buzzed with life, flanked by a forest that knows no boundaries. The guides, often young people who were not born when the reactor burned, became the new guardians of memory. Their voices, firm and rehearsed, recount the chronology of the disaster as the landscape transforms. The outside world fades away, replaced by abandoned villages, their wooden houses slowly sinking into the earth. And then, Pripyat appears, not as an ancient ruin, but as the disturbing echo of a future that never was. The path leads visitors through avenues where the birches have broken the hold of the asphalt. They stop in front of school number 3, where textbooks still lie open on the desks, covered by a thick layer of dust and fallen plaster. The floor is carpeted with gas masks, an iconic image, although the guides explain with melancholy that they were placed there long after, a macabre adornment for photographers. The act of visiting is a ritual. One walks through the energetic palace of culture, once the beating heart of the city, now a skeleton of marble and broken glass. The Olympic swimming pool is contemplated, its diving board suspended over a void of cracked tiles. And, of course, one arrives at the central square, where the yellow Ferris wheel rises as the definitive symbol of a time frozen. It was to be inaugurated for the celebrations of May 1st in 1986. It never turned with the laughter of children. Its stillness is more eloquent than any monument. For those walking these streets, the experience is profoundly human. On their faces, a mixture of fascination and sacred sadness can be read. It is not just the sight of decay that moves, but the overwhelming presence of interrupted lives. Each abandoned doll in a crib, each lonely shoe in a hallway, is a fragment of a lineage that was abruptly cut off. Visitors do not just see a city, they feel the weight of 49,000 absences. This influx has had an unexpected consequence. Efforts to preserve Pripyat intensified. There is debate about whether it should be an open-air museum, a monument to technological arrogance, a Pompeii of the atom. In 2021, the Ukrainian government initiated the process for the exclusion zone to be declared a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. The goal is no longer just to contain the invisible poison, but to safeguard the lesson inscribed in stone and rust. The rebirth of Pripyat is this paradox. To save its memory, it must be open to the world, allowing thousands of strangers to leave their footprints on the ashes of a failed dream. At the end of the day, the buses withdraw, leaving the ghost city once again to its silence and its wolves. But visitors take away something more than photographs. They carry the echo of the dosimeter in their ears. Each captured image is not just the epitaph of a city. It is a witness that travels outside the zone, carrying with it a silent question about the price of our ambition. A question that would resonate in the halls of power and in the blueprints of every new reactor, forever changing the lineage of nuclear energy. As moss and young trees began to reclaim the silent concrete of Pripyat, a shockwave, much slower but immensely broader than the initial explosion, spread across the world. It was not a wave of radiation, but of awareness, a wave of fear. The name of Chernobyl, first whispered in the halls of intelligence agencies and then shouted in the headlines of the world, ceased to be a place on a map and became a symbol, an open wound in humanity's blind faith in its control over the atom. The ash carried by the wind to Sweden contained not only cesium-137, it also bore the seed of doubt. Until that spring of 1986, nuclear energy, despite its controversies, still retained the aura of a clean and powerful future. It was the domesticated Promethean fire, the beating heart of industrial modernity. In the boardrooms of the West and in the planning committees of the East, reactors were pieces on a grand geopolitical and economic chessboard. They were monuments of stone and steel to national ambition. But after the 26th of April, the constant hum of those plants began to sound different in the ears of the world. It was no longer just the music of progress. It now contained a dissonance, the distant echo of a siren in an abandoned Ukrainian city. The reaction was not uniform, but a tide that rose differently on each shore. In Italy, the shock was so profound that, a year later, a national referendum sealed the fate of its nuclear program. It was a decision of the people, not of politicians. A collective, almost philosophical renunciation of a form of power that had proven too terrible. In Sweden, which had already voted for a gradual phase-out, Chernobyl acted as an unrelenting catalyst, transforming a long-term plan into a moral urgency. The nuclear winter was no longer an abstract theory of the Cold War. It was a tangible possibility that had brushed against its own fields. Other countries, like Germany, witnessed how the anti-nuclear movement, once a minority voice, became an unstoppable political force, its roots deeply embedded in the fertile ground of public fear. Even in nations that did not abandon the nuclear path, such as France, Japan, or the United States, nothing was ever the same again. The disaster imposed a forced humility on an industry accustomed to pride. The era of secrecy and national sovereignty in matters of safety crumbled. From the smoking ruins of Reactor 4 was born the World Association of Nuclear Operators. It was a tacit acknowledgement that radioactive dust does not respect borders, and that the safety of a reactor in Ukraine was, ultimately, everyone's concern. Engineers who once designed with the confidence of cathedral architects now did so with the caution of bomb disposal experts. Every blueprint, every protocol was reviewed under the somber light of what had gone wrong in Chernobyl. The RBMK reactors, still operational in the Soviet Union, underwent urgent modifications, a desperate attempt to purge the design sins that had led to the catastrophe. But the deepest change was not written in laws or technical manuals. It was etched in the collective psyche. For millions of people, the cooling tower of a nuclear power plant, once a symbol of abundant energy, became a monolith of anxiety. The atom, that miniature sun promised as a servant of humanity, had shown its other face, that of an ancient, capricious, and terrible god, whose wrath could poison the earth for a time that exceeded the memory of nations. The dream of a purely atomic future did not die, but it fractured, and in its cracks grew a new and sober wisdom. A wisdom born of fire and ash, which would forever remember that the power to create and the power to annihilate are two strands of the same thread, and that understanding, painfully acquired, would begin to weave a new safety net, stitch by stitch, with the hope that no city would ever again hear a silence like that which fell over Pripyat. From the stupor that followed the catastrophe, from that tide of fear that swept the world and left a deep distrust of the domesticated atom on the shores of collective consciousness, a different silence was born. It was no longer the silence of secrecy or denial, but that of introspection. A heavy silence, like the one that settles in a house after an irreparable loss, when the living begin to examine the belongings of the absent, seeking to understand. In the conference rooms of Vienna, in the laboratories of Saclay, and in the institutes of Moscow, the radioactive ash that still floated in the stratosphere seemed to have settled on the blueprints and manuals, demanding a rereading. The first echo of the lesson resonated in the very bowels of the Soviet Union. The wounded pride of its engineers, men who had believed they could tame a primordial force, turned into a technical penance. The remaining RBMK reactors, siblings of the one buried beneath concrete, underwent deep and humble surgery. The control rods, whose fatal design had been the trigger for the explosion, were modified. The enrichment of the fuel was increased, and fast shutdown systems were installed, antidotes against the arrogance of their original design. It was an act of contrition written not with words, but with graphite, steel, and zirconium. A belated acknowledgement that nature does not negotiate with ideology, and that its laws are more inflexible than any decree from the Politburo. But the deepest lesson was not technical, but human. It transcended the Iron Curtain, carried by the same wind that had scattered cesium and iodine. In 1989, 2 years before the Soviet Union itself dissolved into the mist of history, an unimaginable entity was born in the days of the Cold War, the World Association of Nuclear Operators. It was as if old adversaries, having survived a storm that nearly annihilated them all, decided to share their maps and compasses. Engineers from the United States, France, Japan, and the Soviet Union began to sit at the same tables, to visit each other's plants, to point out failures and share solutions with a frankness born of shared fear. The secret, that dark god that had allowed the disaster to grow in the shadows, was overthrown. From these meetings emerged a new gospel, the culture of safety. An idea as simple as it was revolutionary. It dictated that safety was not a list of rules to obey, but an attitude, a constant doubt, a right and a duty to question. The youngest operator in the control room had to have the authority to stop a procedure if they felt something was wrong, without fear of punishment. It was the direct antithesis of the rigid and fearful chain of command that had condemned reactor number 4. This new culture was a spiritual lineage that connected every worker in every plant around the world, a silent oath made to the ghosts of Pripyat. Thus, the legacy of Chernobyl was inscribed in stone and in code. The new generations of reactors were designed with passive safety systems, mechanisms that do not depend on human action or electricity to function, but on the immutable laws of physics, such as gravity or convection. They were built to fail safely so that, in the worst-case scenario, their burning heart would extinguish by itself, like a fire that suffocates for lack of air. Every reinforced weld, every revised emergency protocol, every drill solemnly executed in a plant in Finland or South Korea is an invisible monument to the firefighters of Chernobyl, to the helicopter pilots, to the miners of Tula. The nuclear safety of the modern world was built on their bones. It is a heavy inheritance, paid with a cost that no accounting can calculate, because while engineers learn to redesign machines and politicians to draft treaties, the harshest lesson, the one written on the body and in memory, was just beginning to be told by those who had lived it. Their voices, until then a murmur beneath the roar of official history, awaited their moment to speak, not of isotopes or megawatts, but of the color of the sky that April morning and the silence that came afterward. The lessons of the catastrophe were etched over time into the cold safety manuals and international protocols. They became regulations, paragraphs of ink on paper that attempted to confine the atom with reason. But the deeper lessons, those that cannot be archived, were not written with ink, but with the very substance of life. They were engraved in the memory of the men and women who survived, silent echoes in the landscape of their souls. Talking about the survivors is not recounting a story of victory, but of persistence. It is descending into an inner exile from which one never fully returns. After the evacuation, after the official silence and the explosion of truth, hundreds of thousands of people found themselves adrift in their own country. They were the inhabitants of Pripyat and the forgotten villages, scattered across the Soviet Union like seeds thrown into uncertain wind. They were given a new home, an apartment in an anonymous block in Kiev or Minsk. But a home is not just a roof. It is the weight of history beneath one's feet, the familiar scent of the earth after rain, the tree one saw grow. All of that was torn from them. For them, time fractured. There exists a before, a world bathed in an almost mythical light, filled with laughter in the parks of Pripyat, with the promise of a bright and atomic future. And there exists an after, a perpetual present, tinged by absence. A woman, now a grandmother, closes her eyes and does not see the walls of her apartment in the city, but the balcony of her apartment on Lenin Avenue, the clothes hanging that she never collected, the toy of a child abandoned in the rush of an evacuation that was promised to be temporary. The sound of a distant siren is not a police car. It is the echo of that April morning, a wound that time does not close, but merely covers with a thin layer of forgetfulness. And then there are the liquidators who live to tell the tale, men who walked on the roof of the reactor, who breathed the dust of graphite and fuel, who faced an enemy without a face or sound. Their bodies became maps of the disaster, the fatigue that never leaves them, the pain in their bones that heralds winter, the constant visits to hospitals. They became the Chernobyltsi, a word that marked them, sometimes with the honor of heroism, other times with the stigma of fear. In a society that feared invisible contamination, they sometimes felt like ghosts, bearers of a plague that no one could see but that everyone sensed. Rebuilding their lives was a battle fought in the silence of their homes, a struggle to find purpose when the body has become a battlefield. Rebuilding was not about erecting new walls, but about learning to trust the world again. Trusting in the tap water, in the milk for their children, in their own bodies. It was finding the strength to plant a small garden, even with the ancestral fear that the soil might be poisoned. It was, above all, the act of telling the story to the children and grandchildren who were born afterward, so that the name of Pripyat would not be just a curiosity on a tourist map, but a lineage of memory. In their tales, in their voices cracked by remembrance, Chernobyl ceased to be an accident and became a human tragedy, woven with the threads of love, loss, and a strange and melancholic form of hope. Each of them, the evacuee, the liquidator, the child who grew up in the shadow of the reactor, became a living archive. Their bodies, an involuntary testimony to the effects of radiation. Their questions about the health of their children, about the illnesses that seemed to flourish in their communities, became a silent cry. A cry that science, with its slow and methodical pulse, was just beginning to hear, seeking answers in blood, in genes, in the invisible legacy that the explosion had left in the human lineage. The voices of the survivors slowly fade away, like the last embers of a bonfire that has burned all night, leaving behind the cold and the weight of the stories told. But in the silence they leave, another language begins to be deciphered. It is not a language of personal pain, nor of fragmented memories, but one of figures, of isotopes and of natural laws put to the test. It is the language of science, a discipline that arrived in Chernobyl not to judge, but to understand the magnitude of the wound. The exclusion zone, that shroud of 30 kilometers woven with barbed wire and decrees, became the most vast and terrible laboratory that humanity has ever known. An unintentional experiment on an unimaginable scale. There, where human time came to a sudden halt, other cycles began to be measured. Men and women dressed in the sterile white of protectors, with the faint buzzing of dosimeters as their only music, walked through the same empty streets that once resonated with the laughter of children. They were not liquidators with shovels, but with field notebooks and Geiger counters. They were the new chroniclers of the catastrophe, tasked with reading the invisible runes that radiation had etched into the earth, into the water, and into flesh. Their work was a form of archaeology of disaster. They excavated not in search of lost cities, but of uncomfortable truths. They studied the moss that grew over the cracked concrete of Pripyat, a simple organism that accumulated cesium and strontium like a silent witness. They analyzed the lineage of field mice and swallows, searching in their DNA for the scars of invisible poison, the mutations that whispered stories of a struggle for survival at the cellular level. In the famous Red Forest, where the pines died standing, tinged with a spectral color from the lethal dose of radiation, scientists observed how life, tenacious and stubborn, began to return. The fallen trees did not decompose at the normal rate. The fungi and bacteria responsible for that eternal cycle had also suffered the blow. The forest was a silent monument to the interruption of natural law. And amidst the desolation, a paradox emerged that chilled the blood. Nature, freed from the hand of man, returned with a wild and silent force. Packs of wolves, whose presence had been anecdotal, reclaimed the empty streets. Wild boars rooted in the abandoned gardens. White-tailed eagles nested in the upper floors of the deserted buildings. The zone became a nature reserve, a poisoned paradise where the absence of humans allowed for a biological rebirth. It was a humble and terrible lesson. The worst ecological disaster created by man had become a sanctuary for wildlife, precisely because we were no longer there. But the deepest and most dangerous research was being conducted in the shadow of the reactor itself. Physicists and engineers struggled to understand the beast that slept beneath the sarcophagus. With robots and drilling, they mapped the radioactive magma that had solidified in the basement of Unit 4, the corium, a black and lethal mass, the famous elephant's foot. Studying its composition, its temperature, its slow but inexorable decay, was vital to predict its future behavior and prevent a new catastrophe. It was like listening to the heart of molten stone of a sleeping monster. This science, born from ash and strontium, offered no comfort. Each data point collected was the echo of a life altered, each graph a silent tombstone for a lost harvest or a sick forest. The knowledge gained was immense and forever changed nuclear safety, radiobiology and disaster management. But it was a bitter knowledge, paid for with the sacrifice of the liquidators and the health of hundreds of thousands. Science could measure cesium-137 in the soil, but it could not measure the weight of absence in an empty home. It could trace the dispersion of the radioactive cloud, but not the map of fear that settled in the heart of Europe. And as the graphs filled with lines and figures, history prepared to become something else. Memory, myth, the ghost that would inhabit the soul of a generation. Science delivered its truths to us, distilled in reports and graphs, cold and sharp like fragments of graphite scattered across a rooftop. It spoke to us of becquerels and half-lives, of isotopes and syndromes. But human memory does not dwell in the realm of data. It is something else. It is a slow tide that carries with it the echo of voices, the weight of silence, and the color of an April sky that was tainted with poison. It is a landscape that forms, grain by grain, in the collective soul. And Chernobyl, more than a place on a map, has become a vast and melancholic landscape within us. At first, memory was a whisper. Stories told in poorly lit kitchens, far from the watchful ear of the state. The memory of the metallic taste in the mouth. The vision of that impossible glow on the horizon. The hasty farewell to a home that would never be seen again. They were fragmented memories, personal, jealously guarded like relics of a lost world. It was the writer Svetlana Alexievich who first wove those whispers into a monumental tapestry. She did not write a history of the catastrophe. She composed an oratorio of loss, a polyphonic choir where each voice, the liquidators, the widows, the evacuated childs, sang its own desolate truth. She taught us that history is not made only of great decisions, but of the lineage of small sorrows that these leave in their wake. But time, like water, wears down stone and transforms the contours of memory. For a new generation, born under cleaner skies, Chernobyl was no longer an open wound, but an echo, a modern legend that arrived through new bards, filmmakers, novelists, creators of virtual worlds. Suddenly, screens lit up with the story. An acclaimed television series returned faces to the anonymous names of the reports, sweat and fear to the technical diagrams. The whole world saw Legasov hesitate, Szczebina cough into his handkerchief. Firefighters walk toward an invisible death. It was a powerful resurrection, one that humanized the atom and forced us to confront the cost of lies. At the same time, other narratives took shape in the shadows of fiction. Video games imagined a zone filled with anomalies and mutant creatures, a gothic fantasy built upon the ashes of a real tragedy. In these stories, horror became adventure, suffering a challenge to overcome. And so, the memory of Chernobyl bifurcated. On one side, the rigorous and painful testimony. On the other, the dark and fascinating myth. Two rivers flowing from the same broken source, but watering very different lands in our imagination. And then there is the memory of stone and rust, Pripyat. The ghost town has become a destination, an atomic Pompeii to which travelers from all over the world pilgrimage. They walk through its silent avenues, where trees have broken through the asphalt. They gaze at the motionless Ferris wheel, a metal skeleton silhouetted against the grey sky, a universal symbol of a joy that never came to be. In those empty halls, among dust-covered school books and forgotten dolls, the visitor does not seek data, but a feeling. They seek to feel the cold of absence, to hear the silence that weighs more than any sound. It is a tourism of desolation, an attempt to touch the physical texture of forgetting, even at the risk of turning tragedy into mere spectacle. Memory, like moss, grows slowly over the architecture of the past, softening its edges, giving it a new color. Sometimes it dangerously beautifies, other times it simply testifies that something lived there. The name of Chernobyl has become a universal metaphor for technological disaster and human hubris. But in that abstraction, we run the risk of forgetting the deepest lesson: that every atom of the catastrophe fell upon a life, a dream, a love. The memory of Chernobyl is, therefore, not a closed story, but a conversation we maintain with the ghosts of the past. It is a living archive that feeds on science, art, and the silence of contaminated fields. And in that memory, in the need to continue telling it, lies the seed of vigilance. Memory is not a tomb. It is a lighthouse that illuminates not only the ruins we leave behind, but the uncertain path that, as a civilization, we still have ahead of us. And so, we arrive at the end of our narrative, a journey that began in the glow of atomic ambition and descended into the darkness of a core exposed to the sky. We have walked through the silent streets of Pripyat, felt the metallic chill in the hearts of the Liquidators, and listened to the echo of lies crumbling alongside the concrete of the Kremlin. Now we pause. The air no longer trembles with the roar of helicopters, but with the whisper of the wind that caresses the young birches. History does not end in ash. It seeks, with the stubbornness of life itself, a new beginning. Above the wounded landscape, where once the first sarcophagus stood, a monument to despair built in haste and sacrifice, now a new form arches on the horizon. It is the new safe confinement, a cathedral of steel and titanium so vast that it could house a fleet of ancient cathedrals within. It was not forged in the secrecy of a superpower, but in full view of the world, with the sweat and ingenuity of dozens of nations. Its smooth silver curve is not an act of pride, but of humility. It is a shield, a solemn promise made to a future that has yet to be born, a pact to contain the poison that sleeps beneath, to watch over its long and slow decay for a century. It is the architecture of responsibility, Within the exclusion zone, nature has reclaimed its territory with an indifferent and primal force. Where once the laughter of children rang out, now the howl of the wolf is heard. Wild horses, descendants of an almost extinct lineage, gallop through fields where cesium has settled in the soil like an invisible frost. Eagles and lynxes have returned. It is a paradoxical Eden, an open-air laboratory where life demonstrates its incredible tenacity. But let us not be deceived. This is not a simple story of healing. It is a life that has learned to coexist with a wound that does not close. Every leaf, every fur, every bone is a living archive that narrates the story of adaptation under the persistent shadow of the atom. Scientists who venture into this silent realm do not seek miracles, but understanding. They take samples of moss, analyze the genetic lineage of rodents, attempting to decipher the long whisper of radiation in the code of life. And among the forests, in wooden cabins that are slowly sinking into the earth, a human echo still persists. They are the Samozli, the self-repatriated. Elders who, after the evacuation, chose to return. They opted for the familiar risk of their contaminated home over the anonymous safety of exile. Their challenge is not political, it is existential. It is the human need to die on the land that saw us born, an act of love so profound that it defies science itself. They are the last guardians of a fading memory, their wrinkles a map of all that was lost. Beyond the zone, the legacy of Chernobyl has transformed into a lesson etched in fire in the soul of nuclear engineering. The arrogance of the peaceful atom shattered that April night. From its ruins, a new philosophy was born, the culture of safety. Next-generation reactors are now designed with passive safety systems, which do not rely on human intervention or electricity to prevent a catastrophe, but on the immutable laws of physics, gravity, convection. More trust is placed in the wisdom of nature than in the fallibility of man. Chernobyl forced humanity to confront its most powerful creation and to finally treat it with the respect and fear it deserves. The tragedy, like a receding tide, has revealed new ground, a future of hope. Not a blind hope, but one forged in the knowledge of disaster. It is the hope seen in the international collaboration that sealed the wound. It is the hope felt in the tenacity of the red forest that is turning green again. It is the hope that beats in the hearts of scientists who dedicate their lives to understanding and protecting. The fire of reactor number 4 has been extinguished, but its ghostly light remains, no longer as a harbinger of apocalypse, but as a perpetual beacon that illuminates our path. It reminds us that power without wisdom is the architect of ruin, and that memory, as painful as it may be, is the only compass we have to navigate the uncertain waters of tomorrow. The story of Chernobyl does not conclude with the silence of death, but with the long and patient breath of life that continues.